Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. Today, I am joined with my very good friend Siddhant, and we'll be talking about Kubernetes security. We'll be diving deep today with TLS certificates. So, if you are someone who is very interested in Kubernetes security, or if you're just beginning out, or just want to get a grasp of what it is all about, then this stream is going to be for you. So, without further ado, I would like to call Siddhant on the stage. Let's see what he has to talk about.
Hey everyone. Hope everyone's doing great. How are you doing, Shivang?
I'm fine, Sid. How are you?
I'm doing good. Just wrapped up a bit of work before coming for the
Mhm.
stream. Yep.
We all are busy in something or the other thing, right?
True. All right then. Can we start? I think what we should do today is first just take a overview at what TLS is, basically what all the certificates files are, not in a Kubernetes context. First, we'll just take a look at it at a concept itself. After that, we'll take a look at it in a Kubernetes context. Does that sound good?
Yeah, sure.
All
Seems good
right
to
then.
me.
Okay, I see some folks in the chat. Hey Kunal, hey Sayan.
Hey, Kunal. Hey, Sayan.
All
You
right.
guys doing?
Shivang, you're going to have to tell me if my diagrams are not visible because I'm a bit bad at Excali.
Sure.
All right. So we're talking about TLS certificates, right? So first, what exactly are TLS certificates? Now, every time you visit any single website, think of it whether it's Twitter, whether it's LinkedIn, or anything else, there needs to be some sort of way that your browser knows that it is connecting to the correct endpoint. All right, now what do I mean? Let's say this box right here is your browser. Let me zoom in. All right, so this box is your browser. All right, your
Sid, I don't think it's showing. Yeah,
all right,
I think
let
it's your screen is
me.
stuck. Yeah.
Okay, how about now?
Yeah, now it's working
All
fine.
right. Yep. So we just have a single box here, right? This is your PC, your browser. Now, let's say you want to connect to a Twitter server. All right. You type twitter.com in your browser and you'll get redirected to Twitter server. Now, how does your browser know that this Twitter server which you're connected to is the correct Twitter server? All right. So, what do I mean by this? Everyone here knows about phishing attacks, right? PHI, not the phishing one which you do with a fishing rod. Phishing attacks are basically you have a very similar looking UI to whatever destination you're actually trying to go to, and you'll enter your password and details in there, and whoever is at the other side gets all that information in a very unencrypted format. So they can take those actual credentials and just plug it into the real website, and that's how you have a security breach. All right. So this is where a TLS certificate comes in handy. Now, what a TLS certificate basically does is it's telling your browser and it's also telling the end server, Twitter in this example, that these two people who are trying to connect together are exactly who they say they are. Right. Um, So, why would that be necessary? I just mentioned about phishing attack, right? So, you have Twitter server here, but you can have a malicious actor in between. Maybe they somehow have access to whatever place you're redirecting your traffic to. So, instead of your traffic going to the real Twitter server, it'll go over to a fake one. So, when you log in, you're essentially giving up all your credentials to this fake entity in between, right? I think this is also called a man in the middle attack. So, like just a middle person hijacks the traffic or does something with it. All right. So, next thing I want to talk. All right. Now, before we actually move on to how TLS and TLS works, I just want to touch a little bit upon SSL as well. today TLS and SSL refers to pretty much the same thing, all right? But why are there two terminologies? Because in the past, in the 1980s, 1990s, somewhere in that era, where the internet was just starting out, your traffic was completely unencrypted. Unencrypted traffic means almost anybody can hijack your traffic and they can read it without any difficulties, right? So that's where encryption came into the place. Now, even if your data is encrypted, let's say from my host, I send encrypted data to Twitter server. All right. Now, how does Twitter know what key to use to decrypt my data? Right. So they don't know how to do that, or without any sort of key or any sort of algorithm on Twitter's servers, they don't know how to decrypt my requests, right? So they can't read it, neither can this man in the middle read it. So that's why we have SSL or TLS certificates. They're basically the same thing. They are the same thing, only the terminologies are different because of the entire way that they have evolved. If you want to learn more about that, then I recommend you check out Hussein Nair on YouTube. He has some really amazing videos explaining the entire evolution of TLS and SSL certificates. All right. Now let's come over to how your certificates actually work. All right. So once again, we have our host and we have our destination here. All right. Now, in order to actually create a proper TLS SSL encryption, there are two things we need. We need a public key and a private key. I'll get to this in a minute, but for now, just remember that both hosts have their own public keys and their private keys. Okay. So I have my own public keys and private keys, and Twitter has its own public keys and private keys. Now, as the name implies, private keys are supposed to stay private, which means they should not leave your host OS. They should not get exposed anywhere outside. A public key that can get that can get exposed. All right. Now, why is this entire concept of public keys and private keys important? Uh, what exactly is a certificate? Yeah, we're getting there, Kunal. First, I just want to explain the basic concept behind TLS. After that, we'll get into certificates. So, private keys and public keys, right? A private key is basically how your data is getting encrypted. All right. And this same private key you can use for decrypting your data as well. And public key is similar to that, but the key difference between the two is your public key can exit your host, and the other entity, they won't get access to your private key at the end of the day, right? So what happens in the TLS certification is your host is sending some data to the end server, right? So along with the data, the host also sends the public key. Why? Because Twitter server needs some sort of a way to decrypt that data. All right, we're sending it in a very encrypted format so that even if there's a man in the middle over here, they won't be able to just hijack your data and decrypt it. This may sound a little confusing, and it is, but once we have the entire picture painted, it'll become a bit more clear. Okay. So along with whatever data you're sending to Twitter server, you're sending your public key as well. And at the same time, Twitter will send you a response, whether it is a particular tweet, or let's say something more realistic in terms of security, your login information. You send in your email and password. Twitter says, okay, you can now log in. You're authorized or you're not authorized, right? So even in that case, this data would be encrypted, and without Twitter's private key, I won't be able to decrypt that data. So along with the data itself, Twitter will send me its public key as well. All right. Now, I said that to decrypt your public key, you also need the private keys, right? Now that's the interesting part. Whichever browser you're using, it has the public and it has a certificate. Okay, so we have to introduce another entity into our picture here. This is what we call a CA, or a certificate authority. Now, these certificate authorities are basically just present to sign certificates. What are certificates now? Certificates is again a completely new thing, right? So, uh, your public and private key. First step is, you, on your host level, you'll use your public and private key to create a certain certificate. A certificate is basically just um, a certificate. It's used to determine that you are exactly who you say you are. Okay, but again, another question you might have is, okay, anybody can generate a certificate, so how can we be sure that my identity is exactly who I say I am? Suppose there's a different person here and they generate their own certificate. How does this end server know that this is not me, this is somebody else? So that's where a certificate authority comes into the picture. All right, so you will generate a certificate. Okay, let me put one here. Hmm, if I can, certificate. Like I said, I'm really bad with the diagrams. Certificate. Okay, so my host has generated one certificate, right? Now, how do I make sure that my end server knows whether this is the correct certificate or not? For that, I will first send my certificate to this certificate authority. This certificate authority will first confirm my identity, it will sign it, and that signature basically says that I am exactly who I say I am. Now, how does it confirm the validity, whether the certificate which I am sending to get signed or not, whether which I'm sending to get signed is actually me or not? That's where the entire concept of public and private key comes into place. Now, yes, there is that entire security concept as well, but I'll come to that in just a little bit of time. So, you send your certificate to the CA, and the CA sends you back a signed certificate, right? Now, instead of sending your public and private key to your end server itself, what you will do instead is you will send this certificate. If I make a copy of this, so instead of your public sending a public private key, you will send your certificate, and Twitter itself or your end server, whichever, will have its own set of certificates which are also signed by ACA. Now, there are multiple CA organizations. I'm not going to name them, but one of the popular ones is Norton. They are one of these certificate authorities, organizations that sign your certificate and just validate it. All right, cool. So now, my browser. How do I avoid a man in the middle attack? Let's say there's a man in the middle while I am sending my certificate to get signed, or when I'm receiving my signed certificate. So for that, your browser, whether it is Safari, whether it is Firefox, Chrome, whatever, it usually has a pre-signed certificate. It When you install the browser, that time it will have its own certain pair of certificates. I mentioned there are these organizations which act as a CA, right? So all the signed certificates from all these major organizations will already exist within your browser. So you're basically sending this certificate that came pre-signed when you installed your browser to the end server. Okay, So that's how your entire encryption works in terms of a TLS SSL encryption pattern. So the certificate, we just call it a TLS or SSL certificate, and same thing over here. And this is how pretty much the entire process is working. All right. So yeah, that's a bit about how it works in a a sense. Now, if you want to create your own certificates, you will usually go and use an open SSL command, or there are a couple of different tools as well which you can use to make it. But now the problem with them is that they are quite difficult to understand. They are quite difficult to create. All right, they are difficult to create because number one, you need to mention quite a few information in it. I'll show you an example certificate in just a minute. But for now, just know that creating these certificates is very difficult, and it's a pain, to be frank. Now, why is that so? Because number one, the commands are difficult to remember. Number two, you need to put something called as a CA name, which is another really confusing concept. But basically, that is what you use to validate whether the certificate is correct or not. Okay. Now I'll just show you an example certificate, and after that, Shivang can take over and show you how it works in a Kubernetes context. So let me share my screen once again. All right, here we go. Zoom in a bit. So this is just a Killer Coda instance I've opened. Why did I open Killer Coda? Like because Kubernetes has its own certificates, right? I'm not going to sit and create my own certificate to show that because, as I said, it's a pretty complicated process. So the Kubernetes certificates are located in HC Kubernetes, uh, sorry, not manifests, in PKI. Okay, let's list it out. And these are pretty much all of our certificate files. All right, so you can see that we have we have keys here. These are the public keys of some resource. All right, and then we have a ca.cert. Ignore all of these for now. The only three things I want you to focus on are dot key, API server dot key, API server dot crt. Okay, just these two things. Focus on only these two things. Now, first, let's take a look at the content of what's in API server dot key. So I cat it, and you can see it's just a key, right? So this key is what we are using for creating this certificate. Okay. Now, if I just cat this certificate, you can see that it's again an entire encrypted certificate, right? And it makes sense why it is encrypted. If I want to decrypt this, there's another OpenSSL command, which frankly, I don't know what the command is. So let's just go ahead and Google what the command is. OpenSSL decrypt certificate. Okay, so Googling is the most important skill which we can have, right? So right here, I can just copy this, paste it here, and instead of certificate.crt, what we can do is put API server.crt. All right, and then we get this, the decrypted format of this entire encrypted certificate that we have. Okay, let me just clear first and then have a clear view. So you don't have to understand every single thing which is inside this, just a few things. So right here, cn is just your common name. All right, so this is one of the resources which you use for authorization. So issuer, what is the common name of the issuer? For this particular certificate, it is Kubernetes. Then you also have your validity, that after this particular date and time, the certificate will no longer be useful. All right, Then again, in your subject, you have another CN, here the Kube API server. Now, this certificate is for handling authorization to the Kube API server, which is why the subject over here, the common name of the subject, is the Kube API server. Now, if this certificate was supposed to be for something else, let's say HCD, for example, then the name would be something related to HCD over here. All right. Then you have all this confusing text, which we're not going to understand unless you're actually in cybersecurity and you work with encoding and decoding stuff, right? So this is what your basic TLS SSL certificates look like. So that's all about the basic stuff. And now I think Shivang can take over about how it works in a K8s context.
I think the title is now justified, deep diving in Kubernetes security, because Sid has already deep dive with what, in general sense, TLS is all about. So let me share my screen. Sid, do tell me if everything is working fine from my end
Yep,
also.
sure.
Okay. So are the diagrams visible?
Zoom in a little bit,
Okay.
a bit more. Yep, that looks good.
Cool. Okay. So, well, these are not what I wanted. There's just for, second. Okay. Cool.
Don't worry, nobody's judging your artistry. Even I'm terrible.
Okay, let's make a really big window. And in that, now I'm pretty sure you guys know what uh, certificates are in general, but we'll be deep diving about them in the context of Kubernetes, what these things are. Okay, so I'm just making these figures real quick.
Please give us some context. We have no idea what these figures are.
Sure. I'm just, I don't want to make them in between. Don't want to spoil explaining. Okay, cool. Okay, so in Kubernetes, I would say there are like, in particular, there are like three types of certificates that we really consider. One, as you can see, this is a kind of a server. This one is a server, and it is basically for the services that are used in Kubernetes, that services that talk to each other, all the Kubernetes objects that talk to each other. So the services, for services, we have these server certificates. So we'll just call this server certificates. I'll just realign these real quick. Okay. Uh-huh. Okay. Let's call this server certificates. And these server certificates, as said previously, told you guys, they also have a pair of public key and a private key. Cool. So we have server certificates for services in Kubernetes. Then we have root certificates. Now, what are root certificates? Root certificates are associated with the certification authority. Like I said previously, told these are the authorities that issues these SSL certificates. So if we call them like certificate authority, cool. Let me just make this a bit bigger. Cool. And these are, as I just said, these come under root certificates. We can call them root certificates. And again, as server certificates, these also have a pair of public and private key. We call them roots. I won't be writing public and private key again and again, just to give you a basic idea. And this, I'm pretty sure you can guess who it is. It's us clients. In order to access these server certificates and services, we basically need to verify and validate ourselves. So we call the certificates, these certificates are as client certificates. These certificates, again, as root and server certificates, also hold a pair of public and a private key. So now there are these three basic kind of certificates in Kubernetes. Now let's take a look at why do we need these certificate in Kubernetes. We know for security purposes, but in Kubernetes, why do we need them? Let's talk a bit about that. Uh, So we all know what is a cluster in Kubernetes, right? We have a set of master node and a worker node, right? Like the bigger one would be master node, and then we have a set of worker nodes. Cool. But in these worker nodes, like they are obviously connected with each other. This master node is connected with its worker nodes. So basically, we need some kind of encryption between them, right? Because if there is someone who can access the worker node, we can't just give him. Oh, that's a really big long. Okay. Okay, so if there's someone who can access the worker node, we don't want to immediately give him access to our master node also. So there needs to be some kind of encryption between all these subsequent nodes. And obviously, as I'm a client here, if I am accessing this cluster, I also need to validate myself that I am not I'm not going to use it for illicit purposes. I'm not a hacker. So I also need to have some kind of assurance. I need to give them some kind of assurance that I am not going to use it for. So there's some kind of encryption needed here too. So for the services in Kubernetes, as I just said, we have our server certificates. And if from the client side, as I'm accessing these, I am going to use client certificates. So let's take a look at what are like different server certificates that are inside Kubernetes and what are the client certificates. So let's take a look at server certificates. Okay. So first in the server certificates, we have our Kube API server. Now, what is Kube API server? Just to give you a basic idea, Kube API server basically, acts as a gateway to our Kubernetes cluster, and we as clients basically interact with it with kube control REST API. So basically, it works with the like I'm sending a request to the Kube API server. So it basically works along with the etcd cluster to give me the information that I desire. So Kube API server is one of the servers that we need. Uh, Kube API server is one of the objects that come under server certificate. It needs a server certificate of its own in order to validate. And all these services needs their own. Why do like said basically showed you on Killer Coda 2, like when he went into the destination where all these certificates and keys are located. So he showed that you must have noticed that there were Kube API server.crt and etcd server.crt. What are .crt is a global recognition for certificates, and if you see .key, it's a global recognition for keys. So why do these all have their own certificates? Because as I said above, we need all the like every service in the Kubernetes need to validate to each other that they are like not using their other not using the either one for the illicit purposes. So for that we have a certificate and a key for every single server. Let it be like server certificate, client certificate, so we need one for that. So we have a Kube API server, and basically, yeah, I just said like Kube API server acts as a gateway to our Kubernetes cluster, just to give you an idea what it is about. Then another one that we have is our etcd server. Now, for those who don't know what etcd server is, etcd server basically holds the entire information about our cluster. So basically, like if I as a client send request to Kube API server, the Kube API server will then consult, or if I said Kube control, get me this, so it will then consult with etcd server to ask like what I am asking for. Then it will do fetch those details and then provide me with them. So HCD server is another one of the things that we another one of our certificates server, sorry, not server certificate, sorry. And then we have kubelet. Now what is kubelet? Kubelet basically, as kube API server, as I said, now we send requests. So kubelet is the one through which we send requests to kube API server, like kube control stuff that we on the client side utilize. So it's that's as kubelet. And common nomenclature for kube API server would be kube API server .crt, and the same with the dot key at the end for the uh, for our public key, and this is the certificate. But keep in mind, this cube.api server, this can be changed, like however we want to keep the name, but this is like the common nomenclature that Kubernetes follow. If you will check out the if you go to the destination folder where all the certifications are kept, then you'll see this is the common nomenclature that we follow, but you can keep any name you want. Same with the etcd, it is etcd server .crt and .key for the public key, and with the kubelet we go kubelet.crt. So these are the server certificates that we have in Kubernetes. Now let's take a look at what are the client certificates in Kubernetes. What's going on the client side? So, okay. So first, let's make this cool. On the client side, we have Kube scheduler. Now, what is Kube scheduler? Now, this Kube scheduler helps us, basically to schedule various like let's say I need to schedule a pod on a node, and basically kube scheduler checks what are the requirements for a certain pod, and then it schedules different Kubernetes objects on base of the requirements. So kube scheduler is comes under client certificates for that. And then we have moving on, we have kube controller manager. Now to give you an idea what kube controller manager is all about, kube controller manager basically it keeps a lookout on the desired state of the cluster, and it basically focuses on maintaining that desired state all throughout till the cluster is running. So it basically, yeah, manages to focus on keeping the desired state of the cluster. So we have kube scheduler, we have kube controller manager. Then, yeah, basically who is going to ask for all these services? It is us, right? At the end, it is us. So basically one of the clients that is going to be in the client service is us, administrator, who is going to access all these services. So it is us, admin. And then at the end we have kube proxy. So kube proxy is nothing but it allows uh, communication, or I would say like between the different services of the between like different nodes. If there are different nodes in a cluster and there are different services running on each of them, it allows the communication between them. So kube proxy does that. And then the same nomenclature would be followed for kube scheduler, kube control manager, with .crt for certificate and .key for the public key. Okay, so now these all kube API, like kube scheduler, if it needs to schedule pods, it will send requests to kube API server. Like I need to schedule pods here with these are these and the requirements. Do tell me how can I, where should I schedule these pods? Kube controller manager, if something like from desired configuration, if the cluster is deviated from that, it asks for how many, what should I do, how should I approach this. Admin, obviously, as we talk with our cluster using kube API server, sending kube control REST APIs through our kubelet, and then kube proxy again in order to communicate between the services. So all of the clients as I said, the client, in order to talk, all these clients, in order to talk, will send their request to Kube API server. Now, Kube API server also, communicates with etcd server and kubelet. Wait, let me just, so that it doesn't overlap. Let's just, okay. uh Come on, bro, leave me. Okay. uh what a mess. Okay, cool. uh So Kube API server also talks to etcd server and kubelet. And as a matter of fact, Kube API server is the only service that talks to etcd server and kubelet. No other service, Kube scheduler, Kube controller manager, admin, or Kube proxy, they can never talk to etcd server or kubelet directly. They send their request, as I said, to Kube API server, and Kube API server then proceeds its request, send this request forward to etcd server and then the kubelet. So for we can say for etcd server, Kube API server acts as a client, because it's sending, we can see it is receiving its request from the Kube API server, and same for the kubelet. For kubelet also, Kube API server acts as a client, as it sends its request to the kubelet, like in order to talk, in order to fetch the required stuff that we need. So basically, etcd server is never contacted by any of the services. Kube API server is the only service that contacts with the etcd server. So, and yeah, so we have discussed about the server certificates that are in Kubernetes. We have discussed about the client certificates that are in Kubernetes. So what's left? We have covered server, we have covered client. What is these root certificates? Root certificate is nothing but what Sid explained in quite detail when he was explaining stuff. So it is nothing but the CA. And it also, if you take a look, it also has a certificate and a key file, which is mostly named as ca.crt and ca.key as the common nomenclature. And with that certificates, other services are kind of validated. So I think that basically covers about TLS in Kubernetes. And I hope I have covered everything. Sid, is everything good, or have I left
Yep,
anything
yep,
out?
yep. You've covered everything that needs to be known from a CK perspective.
Mhm.
There's definitely more, but that stuff is
Uh,
a lot more confusing and complicated.
yeah, this was confusing for me at first too, because there's so much to wrap your head around. Because when the thing I said, ki etcd, in order to Kube API server, basically send us request to etcd server. So we for that, it needs to validate that stuff too, right? Because it cannot, we are validating all they have, or their own validation certificates. But in order to talk to etcd server, they have their own certificate. So that is Kube API server etcd server.crt. So that kind of, threw me out a bit, and I had to look this up few times. But yeah, now certainly I have got around understanding all this. And now obviously you have explained TLS the general TLS in detail, so that I've got a great grasp over that too. So I
Awesome,
hope
awesome.
everyone has got pretty good idea. And
Oh yeah. Before we wrap up, I just want to mention that whenever you're creating a cluster, a self-managed cluster specifically, you're not going to go around creating every single certificate file yourself, because I showed you the decryption way, but I never showed you the encryption. So if you look at encryption, you need to first generate your public private pair keys. Using those keys, you will generate a certificate. Now go ahead and get it signed from your CA, whatever your CA is, whether it's a self-managed CA, whether it's one of these big CA providers, or whoever. Okay. Now imagine your cluster has 1,000 pods. You're not going to be able to do that for 1,000 pods, right?
mhm.
Even if you do it just for your control plane components, and you're running a high availability cluster, which means that you've got two or maybe three control planes, which means you have that many replicas of your Cube API server, of your HCD, of your control manager, everything. You can't do that manually, right? So if you're bootstrapping it using Cube ADM will usually handle it for you. But if you cannot, then there's a Helm chart. I believe it was from Bitnami. It was for handling your certificates automatically. So it's right. The tool name was called as Cert Manager. It basically just makes it really easy to manage all these hundreds or millions of certificate files. And if you get on that kind of a scale where you have 1,000 node cluster, you're going to need a certificate manager, right? Even if you have, let's say, a service mesh. Yes, a service mesh, whenever it creates the entire communication inside the cluster, all its custom rules and whatever, usually it automatically gives you TLS support inside, right, out of the box. But let's say something goes wrong and the certificate data just corrupts, you need
Mhm.
some way to be able to manage all that. You can't exactly take every single certificate, decrypt every single certificate, then compare it. Do that for, forget 1,000, do that for even five. It is very confusing. Not even five, do it for two certificates where you have to keep decrypting again and again and again, keep comparing the data against each other. It's not feasible, right? That is
Mhm.
why there is this really nice Helm chart that I like. It's called Cert Manager from Bitnami. If you have time, you can explore that. That's a really cool package for managing your certificates.
Mhm. I think Sid has covered everything in detail, and there are a lot more stuff. Even in CK about Kubernetes security, we have just touched the tip of the iceberg, but we'll try to cover other topics too, if we find time, because we both are involved in
maybe
our
you can
stuff.
give Maybe you can give a sneak peek about what these topics are.
Yeah. So we have API groups. Okay. What are certificate API groups, kube config. We have all these amazing. We have image security, and yeah, lots more amazing stuff. I can't remember all of them now, but yeah, there's a lot more, and I can understand if you like didn't understand, but I'll urge you to watch this video again and again, and if not, then go for a professional one. But yeah, it's not easy to wrap your head around these topics for the first time. That's why I went to said, in order to so that we can plan this stream for you guys. So I hope you got to learn quite a bit through this stream, and I certainly got to learn a lot because Sid was explaining quite amazingly, and obviously I prepared for this stream for so that I don't forget stuff. So I got a revision too. So yeah, I think that's about it, and we'll try to get more streams like this in the future. And till then, I think bye bye.
Yep. Bye bye.
Bye bye.